In the autumn of 1682, a battered ship called the Welcome dropped anchor in the Delaware River after 8 weeks at sea. Smallpox had torn through the passengers on the crossing, and 30 of the roughly 100 people who boarded her in England never made it off alive. The man who did survive stepped onto the riverbank at Newcastle carrying a charter signed by King Charles II, a document that handed him more land than the whole of England put together. His name was William Penn, and what he was building was not a colony in the ordinary sense. It was an experiment, a place where a persecuted religious sect called the Society of Friends could worship, trade, and raise children without being fined, jailed, or hanged for it back home. Within 2 generations, that experiment produced Philadelphia, the wealthiest and most literate city in colonial America, and a class of Quaker families whose surnames still turn up in phone books, obituaries, and DNA test results across the country today. Some of those families gave the nation presidents. Some gave it painters, publishers, glassmakers, and civil rights leaders. A surprising number of living Americans carry one of these names without knowing where it came from or what it survived to get here. So here are 10 Quaker surnames that built Pennsylvania, and there is a real chance one of them is sitting in your family tree right now. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why any of these families crossed an ocean, you have to understand what they were leaving. In England during the 1650s and 1660s, the Society of Friends was not a polite religious minority. Quakers refused to remove their hats for magistrates, refused to swear oaths in court, refused to pay tithes to the established church, and refused to serve in the militia, and English law punished every one of those refusals with fines, seized property, or prison. The Quaker records kept by a body called the Meeting for Sufferings, a committee whose entire job was to document persecution case by case, list more than 15,000 friends imprisoned in England between 1660 and 1685, and several hundred who died in those prisons. William Penn himself was arrested and jailed in the Tower of London for publishing Quaker theology before he ever set foot in America. When King Charles II owed Penn's late father a large debt, Penn asked to be paid not in cash but in land, and the king, glad to be rid of both the debt and thousands of troublesome religious dissenters at once, granted him the territory that became Pennsylvania in 1681. Penn advertised the colony directly to persecuted friends across England, Wales, Ireland, and the German Rhineland, promising freedom of worship, fair courts, and cheap land, and thousands of families who had spent years watching their property seized for refusing to remove a hat, sold what they owned and bought passage on ships bound for the Delaware River. What they built once they arrived was governed by the Quaker meeting rather than a parish church. Meetings kept written minutes of births, marriages, deaths, and disciplinary cases, and those minute books, many of them still preserved today, at the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College and at Haverford College, are the paper trail genealogists now use to trace exactly which families arrived on which ships and settled which townships. It is inside those minute books, land deeds, and disownment records that the 10 surnames on this list first show up in the American record. The scale of the migration is easy to underestimate today. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20,000 and 23,000 people crossed the Atlantic for Pennsylvania and the surrounding Quaker settlements between 1682 and 1725 alone, a wave large enough that within a single generation, Quakers made up a majority of the colony's population and controlled its assembly outright. They built meeting houses roughly every 10 miles across the counties around Philadelphia, close enough that a farming family could ride to meeting for worship and back in a single day. And by the time of the American Revolution, Pennsylvania Yearly Meeting oversaw dozens of monthly meetings stretching from the Delaware River to the edge of the frontier. Quakers controlled the colonial assembly for the first 75 years of Pennsylvania's existence, which is part of why the colony had no official state-supported church, no death penalty for most crimes, at a time when England hanged people for over 200 offenses, and courts that, at least on paper, treated native nations as parties to be negotiated with rather than simply removed. That control began breaking down in the 1750s, when war with the French and their native allies forced Quaker assemblymen to choose between funding a militia and honoring their peace testimony, and many resigned their seats rather than do either. What survived that political collapse were the families, the meeting houses, and the records, and those 3 things are exactly what this list is built from. What you are looking at, if you could stand inside one of those early Pennsylvania meeting houses, is a room built almost entirely against decoration. No pulpit, no altar, no stained glass, no organ, just plain wooden benches facing each other across a bare floor, because Quakers believed any worshipper might be moved to speak, and that no single voice, ordained or otherwise, deserved a raised platform above the rest. Men and women sat on separate sides. Members addressed each other as thee and thou long after the rest of English-speaking society had dropped the distinction, a small daily reminder that everyone inside the room, servant or merchant, stood equal before God. Clothing followed the same logic: plain gray and brown fabric, no lace, no buckles, no wigs, a visible refusal of the vanity that marked English gentry, though as families like the Cadwaladers and Wistars grew wealthy, that plainness slowly gave way to silk waistcoats and formal portraiture, a quiet betrayal the meeting minutes sometimes recorded as disciplinary cases against members dressing above their station. It was this same discipline, applied to record-keeping instead of clothing, that leaves modern genealogists such an unusually complete paper trail to work from. A Quaker family could move from Chester County to the Ohio frontier and still show up, generation after generation, in a chain of meeting minutes transferring their membership forward, a bureaucratic habit that turns out to be a genealogist's best friend 2 and 3 centuries later. Commercial DNA tests will not hand you any of this directly. A saliva sample can tell you that a slice of your ancestry traces to Great Britain and Ireland, or that a smaller slice points toward Germanic Europe. Broad regional categories built from comparing your genome to thousands of other test takers. What it cannot tell you is which specific ship, which specific meeting house, or which specific ancestor carried that ancestry into your family in the first place. That part still has to be built the old way, by matching a documented birth to a documented marriage to a documented death, generation by generation, until the paper trail and the DNA percentage finally point at the same place on a map. Quaker, Pennsylvania happens to be one of the easiest places in the country to do exactly that, because almost no other religious community of the period kept records this consistently or preserved them this well. A family that shows up as unexpectedly heavy in British Isles ancestry, with roots that seem to run through eastern Pennsylvania before scattering west, is exactly the profile these 10 surnames tend to produce, and it is worth checking whether one of them happens to be sitting in the branches above you. Number 10, Wistar. The name is German, and it belonged to a button maker named Caspar Wistar, who arrived in Philadelphia in 1717 with almost nothing. He converted to Quakerism not long after landing, married into an established friend's family, and began buying land instead of spending his profits. Before glass, he had already cornered the colonial market for cast brass buttons, training a workshop of German redemptioner apprentices, men who had traded years of indentured labor for their passage across the Atlantic, to cast a small, unglamorous product that made him one of the first manufacturing fortunes in British America. In 1739, he opened a glassworks near Alloway in southern New Jersey, recruiting 4 experienced glassblowers from Rotterdam to run the furnaces, and Wistarburgh became the first sustained, successful glass manufacturing operation in the American colonies. Those craftsmen taught the country how to blow bottles, window panes, and the thick greenish glassware collectors now call Wistarburgh, and the business passed down through his son Richard, who kept it running for decades afterward. He died one of the richest men in Pennsylvania, having started with a bag of buttons. A grandnephew, also named Caspar, became a physician and professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania, and a botanist friend later named a newly discovered flowering vine in his honor, misspelling the family name along the way. That is why the purple blossoms climbing porches across the country today are called wisteria. That same anatomist's name still hangs on a working biomedical research institute in Philadelphia today, founded in 1892, and still active in cancer and vaccine research well over a century later. 2 generations after the glassmaker, the family split into 2 spellings, Wistar and Wister, and one branch produced Owen Wister, the writer whose 1899 novel The Virginian is widely credited with inventing the American Western as a literary form. If Wistar or Wister sits anywhere in your family records, you may descend from the immigrant button maker who taught colonial America how to make glass, and left his name on a flower besides. Check your tree. Number 9. Griscom. Andrew Griscom arrived with one of the earliest waves of Quaker settlers and worked as a carpenter, helping raise the first frame buildings of a city that had barely existed the year before. His descendants Samuel and Rebecca Griscom were birthright Quakers living on Arch Street in Philadelphia when their daughter Elizabeth was born in 1752, the 8th of 17 children. She grew up inside the plain meeting house discipline of the Society of Friends, sewing, keeping accounts, and learning the upholstery trade from an uncle. When she married outside the faith to an Episcopalian named John Ross, the Arch Street meeting formally disowned her, the standard discipline for marrying a non-Quaker at the time. She later joined the breakaway Free Quakers, the congregation that supported the revolution when the main body of Friends refused to take sides. History remembers her by her married name, Betsy Ross, and credits her, through a family account her grandson William Canby first told publicly to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1870, nearly a century after the fact, with sewing an early version of the American flag. The design she is credited with, 13 stars arranged in a circle, each cut from folded cloth with a single snip of the scissors into a perfect five-pointed shape, remains the most recognizable image in American flag history, whether or not she personally invented it. What is documented without dispute is that her upholstery shop kept making flags for the United States government for decades afterward, work carried on by her daughters and granddaughters long after her own death in 1836. Historians still argue over how much of the original story is fact and how much is inherited legend, but her Quaker upbringing on Arch Street and her ancestors' hand in literally building the young city are not in dispute. If Griscom appears in your family tree, you may be looking at the line of the seamstress the country still argues about, and the carpenter who helped raise Philadelphia in the first place. Check it. Number 8. Milhous. The Milhous family were Irish Quakers from County Kildare, who crossed the Atlantic around 1729 and settled first in Pennsylvania, before later generations pushed west into Ohio and Indiana. They settled first near the New Garden Meeting in Chester County, Pennsylvania, moved with a wave of Quaker families to Columbiana County, Ohio in the early 1800s, and pushed on again to Jennings County, Indiana, a generation later, carrying their meeting records with them at every stop, the careful minute books that Quaker congregations used to track births, marriages, and deaths inside the faith, transferring membership from one meeting to the next as the family moved west. One line eventually reached Whittier, California, a town founded by Quakers and named for the Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier, where a young woman named Hannah Milhous married a lemon rancher and grocer named Francis Nixon. Their second son, born in 1913, attended the Quaker-founded Whittier College and the East Whittier Friends Church, raised inside the same plain discipline his Pennsylvania ancestors had carried across the ocean nearly 2 centuries earlier. That son, Richard Milhous Nixon, became the 37th President of the United States and carried his mother's Quaker maiden name as his own middle name for the rest of his life. He remains, alongside Herbert Hoover further down this list, one of only 2 American presidents raised inside the Religious Society of Friends, and the East Whittier Friends Church still keeps membership records that list the Milhous family generations back, one of thousands of such record books genealogists now search from home instead of by hand. If Milhous turns up anywhere in your family records, you carry the surname of a president's mother. Look for it. Number 7. Pemberton. Israel Pemberton the Younger built one of the largest mercantile fortunes in colonial Philadelphia and became so influential inside the Society of Friends that his contemporaries nicknamed him the King of the Quakers. In 1756, he organized the Friendly Association for Regaining and Preserving Peace with the Indians by Pacific Measures, using his own money to negotiate directly with Lenape leaders, while colonial expansion kept breaking the peace apart from every other direction. His younger brother James went further still, becoming one of the founding members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1775, one of the first organized anti-slavery societies anywhere in the world, built almost entirely on Quaker membership. That same commitment to pacifism made the family suspect once the revolution began. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 1777, Patriot authorities arrested James Pemberton and several other prominent Quakers as suspected loyalists and exiled them to Virginia for months without trial, a group genealogists still refer to as the Virginia Exiles. Pennsylvania passed a gradual abolition law in 1780, the first state in the new nation to do so, and Quaker pressure through families like the Pembertons is part of the documented reason why. A short residential street in Philadelphia's Society Hill neighborhood still carries the Pemberton name today, a quiet, easy-to-miss marker for a family that once shaped the city's politics, its charity, and its conscience all at once. If Pemberton is in your family tree, you descend from a name Philadelphia once called royalty, in its own quiet, plain-dressed way. Check it. Number 6. Logan. James Logan arrived in Pennsylvania from Ireland in 1699 as William Penn's private secretary, and he ended up running most of the colony's actual business while Penn spent the bulk of his later years back in England settling debts and disputes. Logan negotiated land purchases with the Lenape for decades, and in 1737 he helped arrange what became known as the walking purchase, a deal that used a fraudulently measured day-and-a-half's walk to seize far more Lenape land than either side had originally intended, a transaction historians still cite as one of the more shameful episodes of Pennsylvania's founding. He also served as acting governor and built a personal library so large and so scholarly that it became the seed collection for the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of the first public research libraries in America. In his later years, he conducted his own experiments on corn fertilization in his garden, wrote up the results in Latin, and corresponded with the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, who cited Logan's work directly in his own writings on plant reproduction, an unusually scholarly hobby for a man who spent his days negotiating land deals and running a colony. His country estate outside the city, a stone house called Stenton, still stands today and is open as a museum. Two of central Philadelphia's best-known public spaces, Logan Circle and Logan Square, carry his name to this day, a permanent marker in the middle of the city he helped run, for better and for worse, before it was even fully built. If the name Logan sits in your family history, you may descend from the man who kept William Penn's entire colony running behind the scenes. Look for it. Number 5, Roberts. Hundreds of Welsh Quakers, fleeing persecution in Wales rather than England, pooled their money in 1681 and bought roughly 40,000 acres directly from William Penn to form what they called the Welsh Tract, a self-governing barony west of Philadelphia where they intended to keep speaking Welsh and running their own courts. Many of these families sailed on ships like the Lion and the Morning Star, and many carried patronymic names built the Old Welsh way, a son identified as Ap Robert, son of Robert, and when English-speaking clerks began writing land deeds, they flattened those names into a fixed surname, Roberts, that stuck for every generation afterward. In 1695, the Welsh Quakers built the Marian Friends Meeting House, a stone building that still stands today as the oldest continuously used Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania. Welsh remained the working language of worship there for decades, and meeting clerks kept a portion of the minutes in Welsh well into the 1700s before English finally took over completely, a slow erosion of the Welsh Tract's original promise of self-rule that mirrored what was happening to Welsh identity across the whole colony. The Welsh Quakers named their new towns after the villages they had left behind, which is why Philadelphia's western suburbs are still called Marion, Haverford, and Radnor today, and why the commuter line that runs through them is still known as the Main Line. If Roberts is anywhere in your family tree, you may descend from a Welsh farmer who crossed an ocean to keep his own language and his own faith intact, and whose neighbors' names are still bolted to train station signs 3 centuries later. Check it. Number 4, Cadwalader. Also part of that same Welsh Tract migration, the Cadwalader family started as plain-dressed Quakers and became, within 3 generations, one of the wealthiest and most politically connected families in Pennsylvania. General John Cadwalader fought alongside George Washington at Trenton and Princeton during the Revolutionary War, commanded Pennsylvania's militia, and later fought an actual duel with General Thomas Conway over accusations that Conway had schemed to remove Washington from command, wounding Conway in the mouth and very nearly killing him. None of that would have been permitted under the strict discipline of a Quaker meeting, which forbade its members from bearing arms or dueling on pain of being disowned, and by Cadwalader's generation, the family had already left the Society of Friends for Philadelphia's fashionable Anglican congregations. His wife, Elizabeth Lloyd, came from another old Quaker family, and the couple sat for formal portraits by the painter Charles Willson Peale, the kind of vanity a plain Quaker ancestor 2 generations earlier would have refused outright. Cadwalader went on to serve in the Continental Congress and the Pennsylvania State Assembly before he died in 1786 at only 43, worn-down family letters suggest, by wounds he had carried since the war, and he was buried with full military honors that would have scandalized any of his plain-dressed Welsh Quaker ancestors. Their story is really the story of what happened to dozens of old Quaker families as they grew rich, a slow drift out of plain meeting houses and into silk, swords, and the established church. If Cadwalader is in your family tree, you carry the name of a family that started in plainness and ended in privilege. Look for it. Number 3, Michener. The name reached Pennsylvania with a French Huguenot family that eventually joined the Society of Friends after settling in Bucks County. 2 centuries later, a Quaker widow in Doylestown named Mabel Michener took in an infant of uncertain parentage and raised him inside the plain, unpretentious discipline of the local meeting, moving so often between rented rooms that he later said he could not be certain where he had actually been born. That boy grew up poor, worked as a laborer, a teacher, and a traveling salesman before he ever published a word, and he never fully learned who his birth parents had been. He became James Albert Michener, the novelist behind Hawaii, Centennial, and dozens of other sprawling historical novels that sold tens of millions of copies worldwide. His very first book, Tales of the South Pacific, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1948 and later became the basis for the Broadway musical South Pacific, an astonishing debut for a man who had grown up unsure of his own last name. In his later years, he gave away most of his fortune, well over $100 million, to universities, libraries, and museums, including an art museum in Doylestown that now sits partly inside the old Bucks County Prison and carries his name. If Michener sits in your family tree, you may descend from the meeting house that produced one of the best-selling and most generous novelists of the 20th century. Check it. Number 2. Rustin. Bayard Rustin was raised in West Chester, Pennsylvania, by his Quaker grandparents, Jennifer and Julia Rustin, in a house where his grandmother hosted local meetings of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People at the kitchen table. The Quaker teachings on nonviolence and pacifism that shaped his childhood ran deep enough that during the Second World War he refused induction as a conscientious objector and served more than 2 years in federal prison for it. In 1947, he helped organize the Journey of Reconciliation, a bus ride of black and white activists through the Upper South testing a recent Supreme Court ruling against segregated interstate travel, a direct forerunner of the freedom rides that would follow more than a decade later. By 1963, he was the chief organizer of the March on Washington, the event where Martin Luther King the Younger delivered his most famous speech, having spent the years before training King and other movement leaders in the nonviolent tactics he had studied since childhood. Rustin himself rarely appeared on stage that day, kept deliberately in the background because he was an openly gay black man in a movement that feared what his visibility might cost it, and it took decades, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom awarded posthumously by Barack Obama in 2013 for the country to properly credit the work he had done. If Rustin appears in your family tree, you carry the name of the man who organized a march the whole world remembers, and then stood at the edge of the stage without asking for credit. Look for it. And number 1, Hoover. The family began in Pennsylvania as Huber, Swiss-German Quaker converts, who settled in Berks County in the early 1700s and anglicized the spelling over the following generations. A branch of the family eventually pushed west into Iowa, and in 1874 a son was born there named Herbert. He was orphaned before he turned 10, sent to live with his uncle, a Quaker physician named Henry John Minthorn, in Newburgh, Oregon, and grew up inside the same plain, self-reliant discipline his Pennsylvania ancestors had carried into the country a century and a half earlier. He worked his way through Stanford University as a member of its very first entering class, graduating in geology and meeting his future wife, Lou Henry, in a mineralogy lab. Herbert Hoover became a mining engineer, led the Commission for Relief in Belgium during the First World War, an effort credited with saving millions of civilians from starvation, and served as the 31st President of the United States. He is remembered today mostly for the economic collapse that marked the end of his presidency, but 2 decades later, well into his 70s, Harry Truman called him back to coordinate global food relief again after the Second World War, and Hoover spent months touring famine-stricken countries to organize shipments most Americans never heard about. He spent the years after that, well into his 80s, working on government reorganization commissions for 2 more presidents, a lifetime of quiet, unshowy service his Pennsylvania Quaker ancestors would likely have recognized. If Hoover, or the older spelling Huber, sits anywhere in your family tree, you may descend from the plainest of all Pennsylvania's founding families, the one that eventually reached the White House itself, twice over if you count Milhous. Check your tree. 10 names, 1 holy experiment, and a country full of descendants who mostly have no idea any of this is sitting in their own family Bible. Pennsylvania Hospital, the first hospital in the American colonies, Eastern State Penitentiary, whose early reformers borrowed directly from Quaker ideas about silence and reflection instead of punishment, and the earliest organized resistance to slavery anywhere in the colonies all trace back, at least in part, to the same network of plain-dressed families and their meeting houses. Most of that legacy sits unmarked. A street name here, a train station there, a wisteria vine climbing a porch that has nothing to do with anyone's garden design, and everything to do with a forgotten anatomy professor. It is the kind of history that never needed a monument, because it was never trying to be remembered in the first place, only written down and kept. Before you go, a fair and honest word, because a list like this one deals in probability, not proof. Sharing a surname with a Quaker family does not automatically make you their descendant. Many of these names were common across whole regions of England, Wales, Ireland, and Germany long before any of them boarded a ship, and plenty of people carrying them today trace back to a completely different immigrant with the same name and no connection at all to Pennsylvania. What actually proves a line is the paper trail, the same kind of paper trail this list was built from. Birth and marriage and death records tracing back generation by generation to a named ancestor in a Quaker meeting book. The best place to start looking is free. Family Search has digitized huge portions of Pennsylvania's Quaker meeting records, and the Friends Historical Library at Swarthmore College and the Quaker and Special Collections at Haverford College hold originals and microfilm going back to the 1680s for anyone willing to dig. Land records held by individual Pennsylvania counties, especially Chester, Bucks, Montgomery, and Philadelphia, can often carry a family line back even further than the meeting books alone. None of it happens in an afternoon, and none of it is guaranteed to end where you hope it does, but the records exist, and they were kept, ironically, by a religious community whose entire discipline was built around writing everything down. Start with what your own family already has: an old family Bible with births and deaths written inside the cover, a grandparent who still remembers a place name in Chester County or Bucks County, a surname that always seemed a little too plain to have a story behind it. Cross that against the census, which from 1790 onward will at least tell you where a family stood at 10-year intervals, and then against the meeting records once a location and rough date give you somewhere specific to look. None of the 10 names on this list needed inventing. They were sitting in county courthouses, church basements, and university archives the entire time, waiting on a search that most families never think to run. So if one of these 10 names sits somewhere in your family tree, or if it simply sounded familiar the moment you heard it, that feeling is worth following into an actual archive rather than leaving as a guess. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.